Good news is like 80% of the people that I just heard that have no idea what it is. So.
If you know, you know. So we are just a little bit away from the top of the hour, and we're going to start our Tuesday discussions of the work of evangelism and the work of preaching. I think we've got an interesting topic, especially as
I don't even know what the topic is.
goodness, a surprise, as evangelists pivot in the new space of teaching and exhorting and explaining and encouraging people to consider Christ. And so once Terry figures these things out and looks at the thing, he'll figure out what we're going to do with the thing, because you do the thing when you do the thing. Now, okay, maybe I'm not. Before we get into the discussion, though, Terry, there's an opportunity for you to answer an unrelated question this morning to any of the things that might be of concern to anybody at all. And are you ready for our pre-study question?
As ready as I'm going to be, Mr. Phil.
All right. So this is a real simple one. If you could think back to the first date that you had with Duane, where was it?
Huh?
Where was it?
Oh, that's simple.
And how did it, well, I got lots of other questions, but where was it? That's the only one we're going to go. I got a whole long list of things that we could talk about that, but.
So let me just preface this by saying, I don't even know if you know this, but a lot of people know our story that I started asking Duane out when I was in high school and she was in college. She's like 3 years ahead of me. So it took 5 years to finally wear her down to say yes. Not 5 years of me waiting, because you knew me in that time and you knew I didn't wait. There was lots of, as my son and I were talking this week,
Terry, hashtag full send Francis.
There was a lot of, hey, you want to go out? Nope. Okay, here's the cute girl over here. I'll go out with her. There was a lot of that going on. But our first date was at Van Meter Auditorium on Western Kentucky's campus for George Winston concert. And we had, I believe, front or second row tickets. And when I finally knew I was close to getting her to go out with me, I swung for the fences because we both like George Winston. That was on his, he did a tour that most of the music was from the Peanuts soundtrack kind of stuff. And it was really good. It's just him and a piano. If you ever heard George Winston, he's phenomenal.
I was there.
Okay. Well, you were at my first date. You just weren't there with me.
Nope.
Now,
so I went to that concert.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is a year later to the day, we got engaged on the steps of Van Meter Auditorium, and that was in from September to September. And then in March of the next year, we got married at Van Meter Auditorium. So I'm very familiar with where our first date was and what it was. It's very significant.
Well, there you go. And the fact that I was there is an odd little tidbit. There's a lot of folks who went to that concert. Western Kentucky usually had some really interesting performances on campus. And
that's a perfect venue for that kind of concert too. Right. It was phenomenal. Right. So what was your first date? No, you don't get off this easy.
Oh, that's fine. So it depends on perspective. In the short compressed version of meeting Jill, I'd gone out to a wedding for Chris Nicholson's wedding in Oregon, and the congregation had invited me to speak that Sunday morning. Dan DeGarmo spoke that Sunday evening. And a big group of folks went to Wall Street Pizza Sunday night. That's when I told Dan and Serena DeGarmo that I was going to marry Jill. And I was at that pizza event. And now, if you want to move to an actual date,
called your shot.
Called the shot day style. One, baby. Home run.
In the words of Chris Nicholson, you all went out and about to get pizza.
Yeah. That was a really bad Canadian accent.
I can't divorce myself from my Southern heritage.
Yeah,
Walt says that your first date was the 10,000 hours on the phone.
Right, and that was next. And then she came out to visit in Louisiana, and we went to a carnival/fair that ening. So,
what carnival food did you get? Is there funnel cake?
I think we did actually get elephant ear funnel cake. Was the things
deep
on the
fried
table
Oreos.
And actually, she was still a little bit air sick from the flight, and so I ate all the junk food, and she just kind of hung out.
By the way, for those who don't know, in the South, like a carnival is our premier location to to share and prepare and share every oddity of fried food you can ever imagine. Like we are going to every fairground, every carnival, some guy's gone, wonder what that's like in a fryer.
Yeah.
And 8 times out of 10, it ends up on the side of a wagon. Let's just put it out there. So
Yeah, and I think Michael has underestimated the number of hours we spent talking on the phone. I think that's a low estimate at 10,000 hours. Let's get to the work, though. We can
by the
certainly.
way,
I've got a lot more questions.
today that would have been FaceTime, and she'd have gotten so tired of your face there would have never been a first date. Let's just be honest.
I don't know. Look at here.
You're proving my point, brother. You're proving my point.
So we're going to talk about something that's interesting to me, especially as I kind of mentioned before, with the shift of culture around group discussions and Bible classes in particular. And I say this in a very practical way. Many assemblies of Christians are still trying to figure out exactly how they want to deal with new codes, new regulations, new rules, new concerns in light of old expectations and all of the various matters that have to be handled in that regard. But a couple of things haven't changed in this environment. And change number one, a thing that hasn't changed number one is that we still need to do this. We still need to be in person to talk to people about Jesus. And sometimes Terry and I will talk about that one-on-one interaction of sitting down with one person and having a Bible study. That hasn't changed. And I still do that. I have got one this evening where I'll be doing that. But there's now going to open up a new space of teaching that's a little bit maybe less common in some ways, a decentralized Bible study that's not digital. And so it's not necessarily going to be at the building. It may not necessarily be at someone's home, but you're dealing with, let's say for our purposes, groups less than 10. That's an entirely different study than a traditional adult Bible class, which is much more one directional. You'll probably, if you've got a group of 100 people, you have 10 people of that group who are really wanting to engage in dialogue, and maybe 2 or 3 who you have to kind of manage the amount of content they bring into the discussion, mainly for time. It's not that it's not good content, but there's only so much time in those 40, 45-minute adult framed studies. And not all of us are Jared Saltz in college and want to take over the college classes he's in, which doesn't change too much.
Don't say the name. You know he'll show up. It's like Beetlejuice. Look,
I think he's in writing right now, so I think we're safe.
in the Bible class mode, you have a schedule to keep. I think that's one of the main things. Is you. Well, let me rephrase that. In Bible class, you should have a schedule to keep. Not everybody does, but you and I both strongly encourage planning a schedule out. In the adult Bible class, I'm going to cover this much material tonight. I'm going to cover this much material in 3 months, in 4 months, in 6 months. We are not proponents of open-ended adult Bible class curriculum. It needs to be structured. It needs to have a start and an end time, both as a class curriculum and as an individual class. Like, you need to have that structure. When you get into this, not one-on-one, but this even really applies to one-on-one, you don't have as much of that structure. And that's one of the things you may go into, at least for me, Phil, and I think you're the same way. I may go in, one of my favorite things to do in a smaller group, let's say it's not all just Christians from church and it's something we're trying to do to involve like a community study or something, is just take a book like Mark and just read through the book of Mark. I would prefer to get through a chapter a session. But I'm not going to be so adamant I get a chapter through a session that I stifle any conversation and discussion in the process, because that's my goal. My goal is discussion. My goal is participation. And I know this sounds ugly, but in the adult Bible class, it's not always the goal. We would love that, but our goal is also to stay on schedule. And that's not meant to be difficult. It's just, it's that important in that setting, but in this other setting, that's something you sacrifice. So that's, to me, is just from the jump, one of the biggest kind of differences between those two.
Right. And I'll set a little an aside with that. A lot of times, some of the off-track questions are really good. And in order for me to manage those off-track questions, generally, when we're doing those larger structure classes that evening, let's say it's a Wednesday night study, that afternoon, let's say it's a Sunday morning study, I'll get out a notebook, either digitally or physically, and write those questions down. Um, Sometimes I'll want to incorporate it in the upcoming classes. Sometimes it might be a little bit of a seed for a sermon. Maybe
Or an
I just need to
article.
go more an article, or maybe I need to go talk to somebody and
Yeah.
say, "Hey, you brought that up. That was a really good question. I haven't thought about that before." Um, and as a younger preacher, I'll say this: I didn't always do that well. Sometimes I would write it down. Sometimes I wouldn't follow through the next few steps, or even just go interact with someone in a healthy way. But as a sense of improving the quality of my knowledge, the quality of my relationship with the brethren who I'm around, and also teaching effectively, making those steps of great question, follow up, personal contact, and then doing something with it is a great process. But like Terry's pointing out, in these smaller group studies, you can approach things a little differently. Now, I still have an agenda in those small group studies.
Sure.
Um, I still have a time constraint that we try to keep by. I include in my planning, I don't know if you do this, Terry, when we sit down for those things, where I want a certain amount of our time together in those smaller groups to not be necessarily 100% focused. And so that means we're going to stop. We're going to close the scriptures. We're going to talk. We're going to engage and relate. And so I include that in my agenda phase, where maybe we'll use up this purpose. Maybe it's 20 to 30 minutes of direct instruction. Maybe it's 15 minutes of dialogue and then 15 minutes of conversation if there's an hour. Or maybe it's only 5 or 10 minutes of direct instruction, and the buy-in level is high in the participants, and they're going to bring 5 or 10 minutes too from each of them. And so I've got to kind of balance that out and know the audience. And that makes that a different environment than church building study.
There's a lot more flexibility in this kind of a study, though, and that's what I'm getting at is if in the quote church building adult Bible class study I don't stay on schedule, there's some consequences to that beyond just me. Okay, and the other thing is because you have people who are very rigid in those studies, you have to keep those in mind too that want to move through at the proper pace. Whereas if you buy into a small group study, part of what you're buying into is the process of more discussion and a little bit more flexibility. Where I may have something planned for, I want to get through all of Mark, but I may stop, Mark 1, but I may start six verses early as a result of that and kind of go from there rather than all the others. So from that standpoint, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind this idea that it doesn't have to be so rigid. And the other thing about this is, this really is the goal. The goal for me in the adult Bible class study is to cover a topic to a certain degree at a certain level. The goal, really and truthfully, in this small study is more to develop the kind of discussion that helps us all learn in the process. And there's just a huge difference between those two things.
Another way that we can kind of perceive it is to think about book clubs. I know there's some evangelists actually who will work through commentary type books or theologically focused books, maybe even a C.S. Lewis book club, and use that as an open door for deeper conversations, maybe with a neighborhood book club that they'll start in their HOAs or something like that. And so that's a way you can kind of rethink through. I want to be more evangelistic. I want to be engaged in the work in new ways. I can't do the things that I was doing before, but now here's a new thing to think through. So on the packaging side, like you're going to prepare ahead of time for all of this, you can plan for a lot of these things, especially if you know the group you're going to be talking and working with. If it's all members of the congregation, let's say it's a men's Bible study, a Sunday or a Saturday morning men's study, then you kind of know those guys and you know what their comfort levels are. And you're going to kind of figure out a way that how you can get the ones who are maybe a little bit more reserved and a little less comfortable sharing, how can I get them to bring in? And Edwin, I think steady is a fine word. It's not the only word. And we're just throwing words on the page for the titles. You should know that by now. They respond to
Yeah, but
Edwin's
Edwin
specific.
likes to argue semantics. It's one of his problems, and we're
Yeah,
here to intervene on that. And
yeah,
study's a good word, Edwin. Look, I'll say this about all that. Like in the men's study, in preparing for that, this is a great training ground for people who don't normally talk in front of other guys to try to help them ease into that and figure that out, that it's okay to do that. But as
yeah.
a facilitator or a leader or whatever you want to call yourself, that's kind of part of your job. So when I go into that, if I'm teaching a men's study, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to have a plan on how to get everybody involved. It may be that some guy over there doesn't want to necessarily comment, so I'm going to purposely call on him to read
Hmm.
something.
Yeah.
It may be that I know there's guys that comment. It may be that I leave a section of time that's maybe 5 to 10 minutes in my planning where I go, we're just going to go around the horn about a question. We're just going to have everybody's input. Just go one by one, you know, and start off with the guys most likely to talk and cycle through the guys who are most unlikely to talk, right? So there's varieties to do that. I think the one thing that both of us are saying about this is there's still planning in this. I think, while I'm saying I'm flexible, I'm not saying that there's not planning that goes into this. One of those areas, by the way, for me in this kind of setting, when you talked earlier about if there's a question in a Bible class, I'll take that question. I may use that another time and do something else with it. But I'm more prone in this setting to stop and address that question, because of the nature of the study or discussion group or whatever we want to say. That it may not be that I can address that question outside of that group, and it may not be, but based on the nature of that group, that I'll ever have that specific group again together to be able to address that at a future time. So again, I'm gonna always leave me some wiggle room in the planning phases of that to accommodate something like that coming up.
Right. And so right now we're talking about structure and things and kind of getting everyone involved. So you'll have Terry talked about the person who's not very comfortable talking. You may even ask them to read some. Remember, some folks are not even comfortable with that without a little bit of foreknowledge. Some sections of the scriptures, ironically enough, are really difficult to read.
And
And
don't give that
especially,
guy the genealogies of Genesis. Like, don't.
yeah, yeah, he's not going to be able to cough his way through that entire
And
so
beget.
yeah. Um, but here's another thing. Um, we've got to have a plan that incorporates all of that because, Chris points out, if you got a room full of folks and only two people are actually having the conversation, the study, the dialogue, then you're not meeting your big goal. That wasn't your goal. The goal was somewhere else and you needed to reach to it. So on the planning side, pick a few things that work for you to get the information that you think is relevant to the group. Be open to having that stolen from you by the group and something else coming as being, no, this is really what we need to talk about today, and be okay with that. And that means in those smaller group settings, that's perfectly fine. Now, here's about the next step of it, and that's on the preparing topics, content, all that kind of thing. There's a number of ways to approach that too. As I already mentioned, you can do it in the sense of a book club, maybe using a workbook. I know that a lot of sisters I've known that will do studies like this in nursing homes where they've got some of their friends or family members. They'll grab a workbook by someone they know, or maybe something was recommended to them, and they do it like a book club. Hey, I was reading this workbook and I was reading this part of the Bible that the workbook connects to, and let's talk about it this week. And that's basically the structure. I do some of this working through the Gospels, working through John. And so I'll plan ahead in my thoughts. Okay, which are the narrative elements we need to talk about? What are the big moral stories? And like with John as an example, nearly every narrative section where the inspired text is telling us something that has happened, the conclusion is uniformly Jesus is the Messiah. Like uniformly, that's what they push to. It doesn't mean they don't teach anything else. It means that the big conclusion draws there. So that means in my planning for that conversation when we go there, I'm going to make sure that that isn't left on the table. That we talk about John 6 for an hour and nobody remembers that the reason that that text is there is to tell us that Jesus is the Messiah. And so those are things that I would do on the planning side. I want
Yeah.
to plan to make sure that is something that we grapple with. And I'll build questions around that too.
And the audience is going to dictate what's the more appropriate subject matter for you, right? You got to take that into account. Um, One of the things that we were very active in before COVID kind of shut that down was we taught a weekly Bible study at a men's work release here in the county, and we're allowed to go in and do that. And so one of the things we did with that is we just wanted to stay in the Bible. Whatever we did, we just read straight from Scripture. We didn't want to bring any other books in because there's a lot of varied backgrounds and that kind of stuff. And so if we're just sticking to Scripture and emphasizing Scripture and reading through, and by the way, that's a study where we had to be very open-ended because we could have 3 inmates show up or 14, and we want all of them to participate in order to give us the best. So we may not cover everything, but that was the point. Whereas a men's study, we may get a book and read a book because that may be the best thing. Now, I've done, for instance, Steve Farrar's Point Man, which is a great book about fatherhood. But like all books, one of the things that's difficult about that is by the way, should be impressed I read books again. One of the things that's great, but that's important about that is you got to be willing to kind of wade through the weeds sometimes and realize, we may not agree with this statement over here, but here's an application that we can kind of agree on. And so from that standpoint, that while that would be appropriate for Point Man in a group of like men from the congregation to talk about being dads, that's not necessarily what we want to do at the work release program with a bunch of inmates that we have to walk through all of that together with. So when you choose this, there's a variety of things, but it's like everything else. Your audience has to dictate that choice. And that's just the very most primary understanding as you head into this.
Right. And so, by the way, one of the things we've kind of approached in this thing is that we're the evangelist, or Terry and I are the facilitators. We're doing most of the teaching work. Another thing you can do with the structure and the topical selection is to spread that to the participants. So if you've got 10 lessons, 10 people, hey, here's going to be your lesson. And you're giving them 3 months maybe to get ready for their lesson, or 2 months or a month or whatever. That helps in 2 ways. Way number 1 is it encourages them to lead. And that might be a great thing to do in a men's leadership class, is to get them leading in those contexts. But from the teacher standpoint, the preacher standpoint, it's really valuable to not always be the one doing the instruction, to be a recipient of the good knowledge that comes by experience, by study, by consideration of other folks is really enriching. And trying to create those environments is good. And realize it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
And look at it like a men's study is a perfect example of that. Choose a book, but assign a guy a different chapter and tell him, hey, this week with this chapter, you're going to lead our study. Part of that, by the way, is really a real life application of 2 Timothy 2:2, where you're helping teach good men how to teach through that process. And you're providing that opportunity. And we need that. We don't need, as an evangelist, you do not need to create an environment where you are the only teacher. That is not a good thing. And you don't need to be the only teacher of the adult class all the time, right? You need to spread yourself around, and sometimes you need to take off and just let somebody else do some of the teaching. And for your own rejuvenation in that process. But in a small group setting, I think one of the biggest benefits is you're helping them teach. And it's I hate to use this because of what it's, but it is a safer space than throwing them to the wolves in the auditorium,
It's a chance to work out the emotional and the technical aspects of teaching in a new environment. And yes, it's safer. Here's some other things to think about. Obviously, I'm going to speak about some mysteries here, like the mysteries of what takes place in a ladies' study. Having never been there, it's all a giant mystery to me. So I'm going to speak in that regard. But
I've heard some horror stories, by the way, but I will not repeat them because
I've heard some horror stories of men Bible studies too. So
I will not gossip about the gossip that sometimes goes on in small group studies.
But here's something to think about. In the New Testament, as a framing of things, we see in the scriptures a couple of areas where those who are mature in both their lives and in the faith are leading. Older women teach the younger women likewise. Men who are shepherds or elders, they're mentoring in those regards. And so some of that is public work, whether it's a structured, a semi-structured, or an unstructured public teaching event. Those are part of it. But then there's the other half of it, which is that private one-on-one aspect, which is important too. I think it's valuable, male or female, to create environments where we have access to both of those things, and then also combine it with quality instruction and education and edification that takes place in a mixed gender context. I think we need all of those. And congregationally, it's very difficult to build those things. I'll get on my little soapbox for a second. And if you're living in churches that are the Dollar General size churches, you will never see that spread of teaching. If you can't have elders because you're too small, don't ever think you're going to get that wholeness of teaching that would come from every one of those things being available to you, forcibly keeping the group smaller for whatever reasons and rationales that you've made up. Michael Walls points out, the conflict that comes up sometimes, that, there are always those who think the preacher should do it all because he is getting paid. And we almost talked today, by the way, about balancing the workload for some of the preachers that we know who are kind of feeling like they are no longer swimming, but they are sinking under their schedules. And we'll probably talk about that.
They're hastily treading water in attempts to not drown is what they're doing.
Well, swimming is just not drowning. If you didn't know that, that's all that swimming really is.
Well, for me, I don't swim. I just naturally float.
Yeah. Well, that's what
There's that.
Terry. So many questions, so many things I can say. No, but I think it's just important to kind of walk through these ideas of, okay, now we're going to do it this way, and now what do we need to do to prepare for that? Because this is one of the benefits to it. We've kind of hinted at it in a couple of ways. If you are going to see an increase in participation from people who may not participate otherwise, and B, create a place where they might be more comfortable doing so, you're going to foster the kind of spiritual growth that is necessary to mature people. Now, you're going to need that no matter what the cultural constructs are around us that allow us to move in certain ways. Whether we are in first century Israel, first century Rome, or 21st century American Babylon, you're going to have all of that, where you're going to have to say, well, here's some rules. Here's some things that you guys can and can't do. If you go do them this way, you're getting thrown in jail, but you can do them over there safely. And so figuring all that stuff out is not a now problem. It's an always thing. And so we need to be able to work with each of these contexts and not freak out and not be nervous and scared and wondering how this is going to play out for the group, because we can't do it our familiar way. I haven't made, and this is the illustration of it, a keynote package since March. And I love doing visual aids. I haven't made one for that use since March. I'm not quite sure if I can do them right now. I don't know. It's a question. It's a wonder.
I have not made a PowerPoint. I think I made some in March that I did with Zoom, but I mean, honestly, it's been months, and I've always said I didn't have to have PowerPoint to preach, and it's true. But now I'm debating whether I want it, which I'm sure I'll go back to it. But
yeah.
But I think to your point, look, if you roll up in a small group study with a PowerPoint presentation, not the place. Okay.
I don't know. It's better when you're doing the study. There might be
more than likely just not the place. It's a little rigid for the again, as you dial down in number. This is just, I think, a standard rule. As you decrease in number of participants of a discussion, the amount of flexibility increases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you have to understand. And so that's the biggest key to all of this, I think.
Yeah. So this is a little quick conversation to encourage people to be mindful of these new opportunities and to create new open doors to share the gospel. because I think I'm sensing, at least internally for me, and maybe Terry feels of some of those things, a level of frustration in regards to my brethren and me in not being able to do everything that I want to do in the ways that I want to do them. Particularly for the Church at Eastside, one of the things that's beautiful about the Church of Eastside is our congregational singing. It's really tremendous to see and listen and be part of that shared spiritual environment. And no matter how a congregation is slicing through all of the current circumstances, it's not the same.
Yeah.
And so that leaves me feeling in some ways underfilled. And so let's fill the void. Let's find ways to fill that space spiritually, fill that space emotionally. Same thing is true about teaching. Um, Zoom is fine, but it does not satisfy the hearts in the way that an in-person study does. And so that's kind of the genesis for why we're just kind of putting the idea out there and getting the discussion going about being participatory in this way. Terry, last thoughts? We're coming up on our planned time frame here, so I'll give you
Well,
the.
I think one of the biggest frustrations for all of us really just boils down to that the way things are right now has just really interfered with the way things we're used to doing things.
Yeah.
And this is a really as we move forward, these smaller group structures, which can manifest in a lot of ways, are probably going to be something that we all need to be more active in the future.
Mhm.
Whether that's through neighborhood studies, whether that's through men's groups, or whatever it may be, whether that's indoors, outdoors, whatever, it's the small group structure that, at least in the immediate future, with the concerns that so many have, is going to allow us to do more things. And so it's something that we all need to focus on and consider as we move forward.
Right. And I'll add this last little tidbit. If you can find someone locally that you can share work with, start thinking about the collaborative possibility of what God could do with the two of you rather than just you. Particularly for some of the young guys, old guys who are trying to learn new things or explain and understand the new things that they're in. There's a lot, and it can feel very oppressive. And not knowing how to do a thing is even more challenging. So I would just gently encourage shared labor. If you know somebody in your area who's really good, say at social media, and you're really good at one-on-one Bible studies, learn to benefit from each other. And you got a third person who's really good at teaching Bible classes, engage with them and maybe create a context where you help them with the areas that are weak in, and they help you with the areas you're weak in, and you share the kingdom work in a healthier way, because we all have different talents. And I think more of us actually exist in the 10 talent realm, but we underutilize our talents because we only use them for one or two things rather than sharing the wealth across a whole system of fields. Whole other discussion. We can talk about that in a different day. But thanks, Terry. Thanks everyone for participating in the chat. I'll even thank Shane. He doesn't really say much publicly, it seems, these days. He's never on the internet whatsoever. He's never teaching anything. No, it's good to see you, Shane, engaging and feeling better. But otherwise, thanks everyone else. If you've got questions about preaching, if you've got questions about the work of evangelism,
Send them to Shane.
send them to Shane. I know he'll give better answers than the two of us. Otherwise, if you want bad answers and poorly thought out plans, then you can send them our way. And again, have a great day. Take care, everyone. See you.